Your gut bacteria are dying. 45 million Americans live with irritable bowel syndrome. The diagnosis did not exist before 1944. Your great-great-grandparents ate 2 pounds of bread every day and never thought about their stomachs. So what changed? 7 things in 3 generations. Antibiotics, emulsifiers, C-section births, sterile homes, the death of fermented food on the daily table, and 2 others. Each one was introduced as progress. Each one wiped out part of the bacterial ecosystem your great-great-grandparents carried since birth. Today, we are going to walk you through all 7, show you what your great-great-grandparents ate that kept their gut bacteria thriving, and give you the 6 steps to rebuild the system they had, and you do not. In 1944, a Welsh physician named Peters gave a name to a disease nobody had seen at scale before. He called it irritable bowel syndrome. Today, the Rome Foundation puts global prevalence at 10 to 15%. The American College of Gastroenterology puts it closer to 15. In some Western European countries, recent surveys cross 20. 1 in every 5 adults walking around with chronic gut dysfunction. The symptoms are familiar to anyone who has lived through them. Cramping out of nowhere. Bloating that makes your clothes stop fitting by 4 in the afternoon. Diarrhea, then constipation, then diarrhea again. Brain fog, fatigue, and anxiety that doctors will tell you is causing the gut symptoms, when the gut is actually driving the anxiety. Before Peters wrote that 1944 paper, the disorder did not have a name because the pattern did not exist at the scale we know now. 19th century physicians wrote about mucus colitis and spastic colon in a narrow subset of wealthy urban patients eating refined diets. They did not see it in farm labourers, and they did not see it in the rural poor. The chronic prevalence we live with today is a phenomenon of the last 80 years. By the 1980s, IBS had become one of the top reasons adults visited gastroenterologists in the United States. By 2010, the global IBS medication market crossed $2 billion. Half a dozen pharmaceutical companies now make their entire revenue managing symptoms that, as recently as 1900, were medical curiosities rather than a public health crisis. The medical establishment will tell you it is genetics or stress or your sensitive gut, something you have to learn to live with. Eliminate FODMAPs, avoid gluten, take a probiotic. What they will not tell you is that this disease is new, newer than the polio vaccine, newer than the atomic bomb, newer than your grandmother. Something changed, and it changed fast. Let's look at what the medieval peasant carried in his gut, because this is where the investigation gets interesting. In 2014, a team led by Christina Wariner at the University of Oklahoma analysed dental calculus from medieval skeletons buried in a German monastic cemetery. The calculus traps bacterial DNA from the digestive tract. Their findings, published in Nature Genetics, described a microbial community so much more diverse than anything found in modern Western populations that the researchers had to build new statistical models to describe it. The medieval gut carried bacterial species that have since gone functionally extinct in the industrialized world. Coprolite analysis, which is fossilized human waste from medieval European sites, confirmed the pattern. The bacterial diversity in a medieval peasant's gut was 50 to 70% richer than that of a modern American. The Sonnenberg Laboratory at Stanford has been documenting the same collapse for over a decade. Their conclusion, published in Nature and Cell, is that modern Western guts are missing between 30 and 50% of the bacterial species their ancestors carried just a few centuries ago. So what was the medieval peasant doing that you are not? He was eating fermented food at every single meal. Sourdough bread fermented for 18 to 36 hours. Aged raw cheese carrying live lactobacillus cultures. Ale brewed in wooden vats and drunk fresh, still cloudy with active yeast. Sauerkraut in northern Germany. Slow fermented pottage in England. Fermented dairy in every form across the Slavic East. Every region had its own ferment, every household made its own, and every person consumed live microbes by the gram, every day, from cradle to grave. He was also eating fibre at a level that would horrify a modern dietitian. Estimates from medieval food historians like Massimo Montanari put peasant fibre intake at 50 to 100 grams per day. The current American average is 15. The recommended minimum is 25, and only 1 in 20 Americans hits it. The medieval peasant tripled the upper end of modern recommendations without thinking about it. And he ate 0 refined sugar, 0 industrial seed oils, 0 ultra-processed food, 0 emulsifiers, 0 artificial sweeteners. None of those existed in 1382. Let me walk you through the medieval daily food system, because the details matter. The foundation of the peasant diet from 800 to 1500 AD was pottage. A slow-cooked vegetable and grain stew kept simmering in a clay or iron pot near the fire. The base was usually barley, oats or rye, with seasonal vegetables. Leeks, peas, beans, cabbage, kale, onions, turnips. Wild greens went in by the handful: nettle, sorrel, fat hen, good King Henry, watercress. The pottage was not made fresh every day, and that matters for your gut. It was a perpetual pot, with new ingredients added on top of yesterday's pot. The mild acidity from slow cooling and reheating produced a partially fermented base that pre-digested the grain proteins and broke down the anti-nutrients in beans and pulses. Slow-cooked, semi-fermented grain stews consistently produce higher mineral bioavailability and easier digestion than freshly cooked alternatives. Then there was the bread. Bread baked from stone-ground rye, or wheat rye maslin, leavened with a wild sourdough culture, fermented for 18 to 36 hours, broke down nearly all the phytic acid that locks up minerals in the grain. It pre-digested the gluten proteins through bacterial action. It produced a low glycemic loaf that did not spike blood sugar or stress the pancreas. The same loaf baked today using industrial dwarf wheat, commercial yeast, and a 90-minute total process behaves in your gut like a sugar bomb wrapped in inflammatory proteins. The grain has been changed and the time has been removed. Now the beverage. Most adults in medieval Europe drank between 2 and 4 litres of small ale per day. A low-alcohol fermented drink, typically 1 to 3% ABV, made by rebrewing the spent grain from a stronger initial batch. It was the safest liquid in a world without water sanitation, and it was alive. Living yeast, lactic acid bacteria, acetic acid from secondary fermentation, all of it went into the human gut by the litre. A continuous live culture inoculation every single day in his cup. Then came the dairy. Cheese in medieval Europe was almost always raw, almost always aged, and almost always made from animals grazing on diverse pasture. The bacteria and fungi that ripened the cheese carried over into the eater's gut. Monastic records describe daily allowances of 3 to 6 ounces per monk, year-round. And finally, the lacto-fermented vegetables. Sauerkraut in Germany and Poland, pickled cabbage in England, brined olives in the Mediterranean, fermented fish in Scandinavia. A 2018 paper in Frontiers in Microbiology found that the lactobacillus strains in traditional sauerkraut survive transit through the stomach and colonize the colon in measurable numbers. Every meal contained living organisms, every meal contained fibre, and every meal had been pre-digested by bacteria before it ever reached the human stomach. The food was alive, and so was the gut that received it. 3 processes were happening inside that peasant gut on a chemical level, all working at the same time. First, butyrate production. A 2019 review in the journal Nutrients found that modern Western populations have severely reduced populations of butyrate-producing bacteria compared to traditional populations. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid that specific gut bacteria, primarily Faecalibacterium, Prausnitzi, and species in the Roseburia and Eubacterium genera produce when they ferment soluble fiber from plants. It is the primary energy source for the cells lining your colon. Without enough of it, those cells weaken, the gut barrier becomes permeable, and inflammatory molecules pass from the gut directly into the bloodstream. The medieval peasant, eating roughly 4 times the modern fiber intake, was feeding those bacteria with every meal. Second, microbial diversity. The Sonnenberg lab at Stanford, working with the American Gut Project, has shown across multiple studies that gut diversity itself predicts immune resilience, mental health outcomes, and resistance to inflammatory disease. The medieval peasant inoculated his gut with dozens of different bacterial strains every day through fermented foods, raw cheese, unfiltered ale, and direct soil contact from subsistence farming. Third, anti-inflammatory compounds. Long fermentation produces postbiotics, bioactive compounds released by bacteria during the breakdown of food. Research published in Cell in 2021, led by Christopher Gardner and Justin Sonnenberg at Stanford, showed that a 10-week diet rich in fermented foods reduced inflammatory markers across 19 different measurements and increased microbiome diversity even in already healthy adults. The medieval peasant was getting that effect 365 days a year from birth to death. Butyrate, diversity, postbiotic, anti-inflammation. These 3 mechanisms explain why medieval gut disease patterns looked nothing like ours. The colon walls were strong, the barrier was sealed, and the immune system was not chronically inflamed. There was no IBS because there was no underlying dysfunction to produce it. If you are getting value from this investigation, hit subscribe. Every week we dig up the buried knowledge that the modern food and medical industries would rather you forget. The kind of knowledge that gets you off pills and back to real food. While the medieval peasant was feeding a gut microbiome richer than anything modern science can fully study today, a different story was getting written in the laboratories and factories of the 20th century. Almost none of it was written with your gut in mind. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. By 1945, the antibiotic era was in full swing. By the 1980s, the average American child had received between 10 and 20 courses of antibiotics before turning 18. Antibiotics save lives. They also wipe out entire bacterial populations in the gut. Research from Martin Blazer's lab at NYU has documented that childhood antibiotic exposure permanently alters the microbiome in ways that increase lifetime risk of IBS, IBD, obesity, and autoimmune disease. In the 1950s and 1960s, food processing went industrial. The Chorleywood bread process, introduced in 1961, cut bread fermentation from 24 hours to under 2. Refined sugar consumption tripled. Refrigeration replaced fermentation as the standard preservation method. Sauerkraut became a niche condiment. Raw cheese was outlawed in most Western countries unless aged over 60 days. The continuous live culture inoculation that every previous generation had received from food simply stopped. In 1971, high fructose corn syrup entered the American food supply. By 2000, the average American was consuming over 60 pounds of refined sugar and HFCS per year. Fructose feeds bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, and the condition modern medicine calls SIBO is now estimated to underlie 60 to 80% of IBS cases. In the 1970s and 1980s, the food industry began routinely adding emulsifiers to processed foods. A 2015 study in Nature, led by Andrew Gewertz at Georgia State University, showed that two of the most common emulsifiers, fed to mice at levels comparable to human dietary exposure, directly damaged the gut mucus layer, altered the microbiome composition, and triggered low-grade chronic inflammation. The exact biological state that defines IBS. In 1996, glyphosate-resistant crops were commercialized, and Roundup use exploded. Residue is measurable in over 70% of non-organic wheat and oat products tested in the United States. Glyphosate disrupts the gut microbiome, killing beneficial bacteria preferentially over pathogens. Then the indirect changes. C-section rates rose from under 5% in 1960 to over 33% today, and those babies do not receive the vaginal microbial inoculation that seeds the infant gut. Breastfeeding rates collapsed in the same era. Chlorinated municipal water kills bacteria in the supply and in your gut. Children today are exposed to fewer microbial species in their first 3 years than their grandparents encountered in a single afternoon working a garden. Every one of these changes contributed. None of them were designed to harm your gut. All of them did. This is not speculation. The evidence is documented, peer-reviewed, and consistent across every comparative population study performed in the last 20 years. The American Gut Project, the largest crowdsourced microbiome study in history, has analyzed samples from over 15,000 participants. Their results, working with researchers at UC San Diego, show U.S. gut microbial diversity is significantly lower than any traditional population studied for comparison. The Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, have been studied by researchers, including Jeff Leach and Justin Sonnenberg. The Hadza gut microbiome contains roughly 40% more bacterial species than the average American gut. They have no measurable IBS, no inflammatory bowel disease, no detectable colorectal cancer in older adults. Their fiber intake exceeds 100 grams per day, and their food is universally fresh, fermented, or both. The Yanomami of the Amazon, studied by Maria Gloria Dominguez Bello at Rutgers, have the highest gut microbial diversity ever recorded in any human population. Many of the bacterial species in the Yanomami gut have never been identified in industrialized humans. Then there is the paleomicrobiology work by Cecil Lewis at the University of Oklahoma, sequencing bacterial DNA from medieval coprolites for over a decade. The findings published in Microbiome and PLOS1 repeatedly confirm that the human gut microbiome of just a few centuries ago contained species and strains that are now functionally extinct in industrialized populations. And there is the old order Amish. Agrarian lifestyle, limited antibiotic exposure, raw milk consumption, daily contact with farm environments and animals. Their IBS rates are roughly half those of mainstream American adults, and their children develop asthma and allergies at a fraction of the surrounding population's rate. Industrialization, antibiotics, processed food, emulsifiers, sterile environments, C-sections, and the disappearance of fermented foods from daily life have collapsed the human gut microbiome in 3 generations. The disease pattern we now call IBS is the direct, predictable result. You can start tonight. 6 steps. Each one is something the medieval peasant did without thinking. Each one is something you can implement in 1 week. 1. Start tonight. 2 tablespoons of unpasteurized sauerkraut with dinner. Real sauerkraut has 3 ingredients on the label: cabbage, salt, water. If you see vinegar, sugar, or anything ending in ate, put it back on the shelf. Within 3 days, you will feel pressure in your gut. That is bacteria fighting for territory, not food poisoning. Push through. By week 6, the change is permanent. 2. Find a bakery that makes 24-hour fermented sourdough from heritage or stone-ground flour. If your town does not have one, make it yourself. Mix 100 grams of rye flour with 100 grams of water in a glass jar. Leave it on the counter, lid loose, for 3 days. By day 3, it should smell sweet and slightly alcoholic, like overripe fruit. If it smells like nail polish remover, that is still working. Keep going. If it smells like rotting garbage, dump it and start over. Flour is cheap. 3. Tomorrow, read the ingredient list on everything in your kitchen. Polysorbate 80, carboxymethyl cellulose, carrageenan, mono and diglycerides, soy lecithin. Throw out anything with those names. Inside 2 weeks, you will notice the bloating fade. This single change is the most effective dietary intervention for IBS ever measured in clinical trials. Almost no doctor will tell you to make it. 4. By the end of week 1, you should be eating 40 grams of fiber a day, headed toward 60. Beans, lentils, oats, barley, vegetables with the skins on. Track it for the first week so you actually see the number. The first 3 days will be uncomfortable. Gas, fullness, irregular bowel movements. That is your gut bacteria waking up. Do not quit. By week 3, the discomfort is gone and your digestion is faster than it has been in years. 5. Buy an activated carbon filter this weekend. $20. Install it on the tap you drink and cook from. The chlorine and chloramine your city uses to keep the supply sterile are also keeping the inside of your gut sterile. You will smell the difference by the second day. Drink 2 liters of filtered water a day, minimum. 6. Plant something. A tomato in a pot, herbs on a windowsill, anything that puts your hands in soil twice a week. Eat 1 vegetable a week unwashed from your own garden or a farmer you trust. The microbial diversity in healthy soil is the same diversity your ancestors received daily. You have been sterilized out of it. The gut you are rebuilding needs that contact to stay rebuilt. This is not a 30-day cleanse. This is a return to how human beings ate, drank, and lived for thousands of years. The medieval peasant did not have IBS because his entire life was a continuous probiotic infusion. Yours can be too. Real food is cheap. Your gut is not. The story of IBS is not a story about your defective gut. It is the story of 3 generations of industrial food, medicine, and sterility, applied to a species that spent its entire evolutionary history eating fermented, fibrous, microbially rich food. We were broken slowly by every product marketed as cleaner, safer, faster, and more convenient than what came before. The medieval peasant did not have a special gut. He had a normal human gut, treated the way human guts are meant to be treated, in a world that had not yet figured out how to sell him the chemical replacements for what was already free. If you found this valuable, subscribe to Medieval Way. Drop a comment and tell us. What symptoms have you been told are just your sensitive gut that were never your fault at all? We read every one. The food that fed Europe for 1,000 years is still available. It is slower, it is older, it is alive, and it still works. We just have to stop being afraid of it. Subscribe, and let's keep digging up what they buried.